if you've been tracking with us, we've been going through some of these, we're calling them great chapters of the Bible, right? And we're in the book of Esther. Now, we're going to read Esther chapter 4 today, but, which is kind of the middle of this book. But I would advise you, if you want to, we'll be talking about it throughout the rest of the week, but read the whole thing for context. Most of you probably know the context. Esther, they're Jewish people living here, and they're kind of in exile, and you've got Haman, who wants to kill basically all the Jews, right? And doesn't like Mordecai at all. But this chapter, Esther chapter 4, is where we're going to read, and we'll read it, and then we'll talk about it a little bit here. But this is when Mordecai and Esther, we get kind of some famous verses, but we know Esther comes in. Ultimately, she's the queen, and Mordecai is kind of telling her, you should go and you should talk to the king. Well, she would be risking her life to do that. So if you want that context, read the first three chapters of Esther. But in chapter 4, it says, when Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes and went out in the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. That's when he understands this plan of Haman to plot to kill all the Jews. And it says in verse 2, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, and fasting, and weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told it her. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai, and to take away his sackcloth from him, and he received it not. Then called Esther for Hatach, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and gave him a commandment to Mordecai to know what it was and why it was. So Hatach went forth to Mordecai unto the street of the city, which was before the king's gate. And Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him, and of the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. Also he gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and to declare unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication to him, and to make request before him for her people, because she was Jewish obviously as well. And Hatach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Again Esther spoke unto Hatach, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. So most of us probably are, as I said before, we're probably fairly familiar with the book of Esther. And the king had a wife, and he'd had this party and wanted her to come out, and she wouldn't come out. So there's this whole scene before this. Well, then, so he gets rid of that wife, right? So then, because she had, I always think that part's interesting, because some of his elders or the leaders around him, his men around him, basically said, well, if your wife treats you that way, all of ours will do the same. So that's why, he's got to get rid of her. Well, then they have this all this pageantry, essentially, for him to get a new wife. Well, Esther winds up becoming his wife, right? And she's Jewish. Well, in the meantime, one of the men under him, Haman, has this whole plot to kill the Jews, and he can't stand Mordecai because he stands at the gate and wails and does all these things, and he wants to kill them all. In fact, later on, he sets up a way to kill Mordecai, and he wants to, I think, impale him, really. And or hang him. But anyways, so now Esther, though, is in the king's court, but she can't just go into the king. And Mordecai, she gets word that says he had put on sackcloth and ashes and went out in the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. This is kind of Jewish custom, right? He's out wailing. He's really crying out to God, but it's this sign of humility. They would put on ash and put on sackcloth, wouldn't wear like nicer clothes, any of those things. And he came before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate, right? Clothed with sackcloth, I should say. And in every province whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, because the king ultimately had made a decree because of Haman, because somehow he was thinking this would benefit him. And again, read those other chapters. And so they have this mourning among the Jews. They're fasting, they're weeping, they're wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids, they came and they tell it to her. And once she finds out, she sends clothes to Mordecai. Like, why are you mourning? Like, she sends him stuff, and he basically refuses, right? He received it not. So Esther called for one of the king's chamberlains. His name is Hatak, whom he appointed, gave him a commandment to Mordecai to know why it was. And then Mordecai, he sends her word on what's to happen. Well, what's Esther's response? Probably similar to what your response or my response would be. She said, well, you know that, I think it's in verse 11, whether a man or a woman, we'll talk about this more later on this week, we can't just go into the inner court where the king is unless we are called. And apparently the king hasn't called for Esther in 30 days. And so she's basically saying, if I go to the king and he doesn't raise his scepter toward me, like for me to come to him, I could die. I could be killed. Like, it's no special. I'm not any more special than the next person. And Mordecai has these famous words, and we won't have time to go into it in depth today. We'll come back to it later this week. But he basically is going to tell her, who knows, perhaps it's for such a time as this that you are where you are. And most of us know the end of the story, but I'm not going to spoil that for us today because I don't want to get too far ahead of where we want to go for the rest of the week. But what we see here is, again, you look at Mordecai, he goes out and he's in mourning, wailing, weeping, but they're also fasting, right? Even before Esther goes into the king, she tells Mordecai to fast. She's going to fast. She's going to have all of her maidens fast. And so what we see here is that while they were in a nation that wasn't honoring God, and many of the Jews had not even been honoring God at this time, if you read some of the context here, they still, when it came to this point, and they recognize, oh no, we're going to be wiped out. Perhaps this is even the judgment of God that he's using other people to do. They go to the Lord, they fast, right? They're going to humble themselves before him. And we're going to have to pick it up there tomorrow. So if you want to catch up, read Esther chapter 4.